Fran Lab. Here's something. In the Adventures of Fran, this is like not Fran Lab related at all, but in my personal adventures, I was trying to volunteer with a group in Philadelphia. What did she want to volunteer for? I'm not going to talk about the organizations. They're two very important organizations that do very important work, and I wanted to be a part of that. The organizations themselves are irrelevant. It's the process that all of them have adopted that is the only point of the conversation that needs to be addressed. But there's a not-for-profit group that does special work for special needs people, and I found out about them, and I thought I had some qualifications that would really be able to help, and I went down there to volunteer, and I went into their offices. Like what you're doing, I have some special qualifications, I'd like to volunteer. And they said, well, you can't volunteer here. All of the volunteering that we do here, it has to be cleared through this special office that's part of the Central Library. And so I found out that I had to go through this one office, and apparently there's this one office in Philadelphia that basically clears people and gets them certification to volunteer with basically this whole like wagon wheel of organizations in Philadelphia. And so basically there's this one funnel you go through to volunteer basically with anybody. Because if you go to any of these organizations, they only get their volunteers from this one office, and you've got to be cleared through that office. And so basically this office vets everyone so that the people that they get aren't going to be lunatics or crazy people or whatever. It seems like a good system. Part of this system, there are these levels of certification, and one thing you got to go through is like a criminal background check. It's like, doodah, of course you would do that, where they check your criminal records, see if you have any arrests, if you have any outstanding warrants, if you've ever been arrested, if you've ever blah, 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 if you've ever been convicted of a crime, all that stuff. Well, that makes sense. That's just part of basic vetting. But then, in addition to that, there's this other thing you got to go through. It's supposed to be about like an abuse thing, where you want to make sure that you don't get people who have ever injured a child or anything like that, which on its surface is like, you want to make sure that if you're going to be working with kids, I wasn't going to be working with kids, but apparently whether you're working with adults or whatever, you still have to get this clearance. It's done through the state of Pennsylvania, through the Commonwealth, but through the state government, but it's linked in with, I guess, the FBI and Interpol and stuff like that. But it's almost like the security level clearance thing. In order to get this clearance, you have to list every address that you've ever lived at, going back to 1974, and a list of all of the people that you've ever cohabitated with, going back to 1974. And I thought, well, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that because I've spent my life in the queer and trans community, and I'm not going to give the government and the FBI a list of everyone that I know personally and everyone that I've lived with. I'm not going to out a bunch of people to the government. And honestly, how would that let the government know that I'm not a lunatic? It's like, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, naming names. And I thought, well, first of all, I can't do this. And I complained. I said, I can't do this. And they said, well, you don't have to volunteer. And I said, well, this one caveat, this one thing you got to do, you got to give the government a list of everybody that you've ever lived with and all the addresses you've ever lived at. That is a filter that only ensures that you're going to only get people volunteering that are either completely 100% on board with the current administration and everything that they're doing with the security and law enforcement agencies in this country, or you're 100% on board with the federal, state, and local police and everything that they do, or you don't care about any of that stuff, you're completely nihilistic, or you don't belong to any group, any marginalized group that might be at all weary of naming names to all these agencies and signing off on that you're naming all these people, and potentially getting government agencies to be calling people that you used to live with 10, 20 years ago and asking questions to them, intruding on their lives, And then those people coming around you and saying, hey, what's this with the FBI calling me? What did you do? Putting it back on other people. Well, this is a filter, which makes it so that if you want to do volunteer work in the city, you've got to be a very specific person. You've either had to have lived alone your whole life, or you lived only with your family your whole life. So they're going to get young people who don't have any history. They're going to get young people who've only ever lived at home and only have their own family on that list. Fine, they will volunteer. And maybe they'll get old people who maybe haven't had any kind of life or never lived with anybody other than their spouse, or never lived with anyone at all. And you're only going to get people who are in communities where you're not going to endanger anyone by putting them on a government list. So I kind of had words with them, but they're like, well, you don't have to volunteer. That's the system. I was like, man, this is really unfair. So, all of my qualifications, everything that I could offer, not just this one organization I was trying to volunteer with, but several of them. But I am excluded from volunteering because I refuse to name names. I don't mind the criminal background checks and stuff like that. I've never been arrested, never been in jail. It doesn't do anything on me. If it's about me personally, that's fine. But when you have to implicate other people, when you have to name names, people who have every right to their privacy, and my questions to the organizational people who are doing the vetting, I was like, how does this protect anyone? Just because you have a list of everyone that you've ever lived with, how does that make you find people who are a problem? It just makes no sense. You're not discovering anything about a person by looking at a list of everyone they've ever lived with. What are you discovering about them that's going to be part of a vetting process? It's like, because anyone who's a problem, you'd find that in arrest records, you'd find that in police records, you'd find that in 911 logs, stuff like that. That's where you find where people are a problem. If people are a problem domestically, you don't find it by getting a list of people. If someone was really trying to get in to volunteer who was like a predator, they would scoff the whole process. They would lie and everything. But if you're looking for someone who's going to be honest, well, you're just excluding them from the process. It's a self-defeating thing. So I don't get it. But I was excluded from volunteering because I wouldn't name names. And yeah, the cruel reality. And why did they put these processes in place? Well, they're covering their own butts. This is the bottom line. This is because not-for-profit organizations, volunteer organizations, they don't want to do their own vetting. They don't want to be responsible for bringing people in who are a problem. They want to push that responsibility onto somebody else, some other organization. And so the city created this one central office. And so it pushes responsibility. And then that one central office, they don't want to be responsible for giving over people who are a problem, so they themselves are deferring responsibility to the state government and the FBI, and by inclusion, the federal government. They're pushing the responsibility. So if anybody gets blamed for anything, they just push the buck down the line. The local organization that ended up getting a volunteer that was a problem, they push it onto the central office. The central office gets blamed, and then they say, whoa, you got to talk to Harrisburg. We pushed it up to the state government, and they go to the state government. The state government says, whoa, we pushed that off to the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. You got to go to them. And it's all about pushing the buck. It's not about the organizations themselves. They're protecting their own butts. It's about the whole passing of the buck of responsibility that I got stuck in. But in the end, it's a filter that makes sure that you only get a certain kind of person to do any kind of volunteer work. And that kind of person ain't me, because I ain't naming names. I call the fifth in front of the committee. Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Give us list names of every communist that you've ever known, cohabitated with, worked with, known about, gone to college with, gone to high school with, grew up with. You got to give us a list of those names. Nope. Ain't gonna do it. I protect the sanctity and privacy of people that I know. End of story. So I don't get to volunteer. But there you go. The reality versus what you think it would be. In the lab. That's where I work. In the lab. Go berserk. In my lab. That's where I work. That's what you're watching. Friend Lab. That's what I'm doing. Working at the bench.